Okay, so I'm not sure that I remember completely clearly chronologically how things unfolded, but you told me I became aware that you were starting to write a book, and I guess some of my strongest early memories are about the Great You and the story of taming the floods, and uh, I think I knew pretty early on that you were talking about including Dr. Nakamura, who worked on irrigation in Afghanistan. And I had not known the story of Great U before and really loved the story and see now that it is very widely known in throughout East Asia in any communities with ethnic Chinese. And then you had what you called the three esoteric principles. I remember being a little bit nervous about using the word esoteric because to me it has a sort of inaccessible kind of overtone to it. But we discussed that, and I think you convinced me that properly explained and in the right context, it was going to work fine. And then I think the problem that you and I together started grappling with fairly early on was that you were trying to do something rather unconventional with the book. And there was a question of, did it hang together, or how do you merge these different components into a smooth story? And I didn't really have an answer to that, and I really wasn't too sure what should be done, but I think we both realized that there was still quite a bit of work needed in order to figure out how to finesse all of that. And I think you got some feedback from one or more of your mentors who said that your current organization or your current samples, I'm not quite sure what you gave them, didn't appear to hang together into a smoothly flowing story and or smoothly laid out argument. And so I think we were wrestling with that and getting feedback from a couple of people who read parts of it helped solidify some of that feeling. And I think you and I both together came to the conclusion that you really wanted to include all three of the key elements of the I'm thinking of them as three, but what are the three? I thought of the three as the classical texts themselves, the hardcore Taoist texts, your interpretation of the three esoteric principles, and your interpretation of how to describe water symbolically in a way that takes a Taoist concept of water and applies it to many aspects of life, which is, I think, what the three esoteric principles are trying to do. And then the narrative stories, including the mythology and the current events of famous people like Dr. Nakamura, and the story of your mentors, which also makes it a kind of a coming of age memoir in my eyes. So I thought of it as those three components combined. Plus, I thought of it as an introduction to Taoism for beginners combined with a coming of age memoir. So two different ways of looking at what's being folded together there. And so once we decided that all of this was going to be made to fit somehow, then the question became how to do that. And I think one of the answers that we agreed on was that you needed to tell the reader up front, very near the beginning of the book, where this was headed and why it was like this. And so you needed to jam basically everything up very, very high to start with. And then I remembered the introduction to Embracing Defeat, the book by John Dower about early post-war Japan. And I think I told you, in teaching that book, the introduction was really lovely because the introduction was basically one paragraph about each chapter. And if you just decide what chapters you have, put the chapters in an order that you think might be the order they appear in the book, and then you write one paragraph about each chapter for your introduction, I think that will be an interesting introduction, and it'll get the reader on board with what you're trying to do here. And I think, if I remember correctly, you had a copy of that book with you, and you looked at the introduction, and you very quickly put together your own introduction that was very much along the same lines. I thought it was a really excellent model for how to do an introduction to a complex book. So I felt we were really rolling here, and I was sort of enjoying being an editor for the first time. And I've never edited a book. I've never written a book. So all I could do was think about how my long feature stories for the LA Times were edited by my editors in Los Angeles. And I thought, well, if we can get Gene's manuscript edited to a pretty decent LA Times feature story standard, applying basically the principles of a well-written page one American newspaper story, that should be good enough to get either a book agent or a publisher interested. And for me, the end game was simply to see you get a publisher's editor involved, or a book agent who was doing editing involved, where at that point a professional book editor could take over. But I did think you needed a bit of advice to get to that stage, probably. So we approached it from that point, and then we got into some more nitty-gritty organizational things. I thought, I don't remember exactly, but I think one of your early drafts had a not entirely compelling first paragraph, a not entirely compelling entire first section, and we were talking about how to strengthen that, how to make it better. And I think what we did, if I remember correctly, is we removed some of the more mundane or bureaucratic aspects of explaining what you were doing or what you did, how you came to Japan or things like that, from the very, very early parts, and got more quickly to the great you and the mythology that was going to provide part of the core symbolism for the book. And then I think we also had a long roundabout discussion about the wonderful, wonderful Sangasena story about God having a problem. And the problem was that the humans he'd created were giving him a hard time. And ultimately, one of his wise advisors suggested that he could hide from those nasty people in the hearts of people, and that nobody would ever think to look for God hiding in their heart, except maybe a few very nice people. And anybody who thought to look for God in their heart would be one of the people who wasn't going to bother God the way the people who are always fighting and arguing were. A very irreverent and wonderfully succinct summary of what really is at the core of liberal Christianity, the idea that God lives in the hearts of people who care about other people. So there were some questions whether the irreverence of that story might alienate some readers, but you and I think, both thought it was a wonderful story, and it belonged in the book. And then you, I think, entirely by yourself, came up with the idea of using that story about catching the message. It's also related to pointing a finger at the moon. I forget now exactly how you handled this, but I think the idea of pointing a finger at the moon, and the point is not to study the finger forever. The point is to see the moon. And once you see the moon, you can forget about the finger. And I think Sangasena said something to the effect that don't worry about the story, worry about what you can understand from the story. And I forget exactly how they're organized right now in the final version of the book, but basically use both of those concepts to, very early on in the book, tell the reader, hey, I do have something I'm trying to say to you, and I'm doing it all sorts of different ways, and it's not polished in the normal way, but if some of the stories make sense, or some of the explanations make sense, and you can catch some of what I'm talking about, take what you can catch. Don't worry about the stuff that you don't catch. Even the stories that help you catch something, you can forget about the stories. The point here is basically to see the moon, to see what people mean when they talk about the Tao. And with the help of your explanations, with the help of your stories, with the help of the Great You story, and with the help of Dr. Nakamura's heroic achievements to building irrigation, one can see what the authors of the Taoist canon were talking about approximately 2,500 years ago. And in this very succinct, wonderful language of classical Chinese, illuminating, ambiguous, colorful, succinct, people are talking about this stuff. And it's easy to miss it in translation. And it just sounds like pretty language that's hard to understand, with a few easy to understand gems of wisdom nestled in between it. But if you really can pick and see what they're talking about, they're talking about things that are 100% relevant to life today. It's relevant to global warming and why we have trouble stopping global warming. It's relevant to all environmental issues. It's relevant to human society. It's relevant to geopolitics. It's relevant to personal behavior. It's relevant to mental health, to personal happiness, to success at your work, to not letting work dominate your life. All of these things that the Taoist writers were talking about collectively, feeding off each other intellectually 2,500, 2,000 years ago. All of that stuff is understandable today, and it speaks to us today. And I think even for somebody totally new, reading this book and thinking about the difference between Yu's father, who tried to stop the water with brute force and hold it back. So we're going to dam up the water here and dam up the water there and dam up the water there. And at first it works great, and then the dams break and you have the worst flood than ever. While Yu guides the water into marshes and lowlands where nobody lives and where it's allowed for the water to go. And he nurtures the water and nurtures the land and doesn't use brute force, and without being so extremely activist, he achieves something. And Nakamoto the same way. He's extremely active. He works very hard, but he's not forcing things on Afghanistan in the way that the American and NATO military actions were forcing things. It's a far more gentle approach. So those things help bring the classical Taoist scriptures, or canons, I should say, texts, to life. And I think the reader can see things of how that wisdom from ancient times is really just simply human wisdom that can be seen and learned by anybody simply looking at the world and society with an open heart. And then you have examples of people like Scott Rizal and his work to try to improve childhood education and childhood in general in China, or the various other mentors and role models that you have met personally and who influenced your life and who achieved certain things in a way that you perceive as being somewhat Taoist inspired. And you graciously include a few pages about myself, and I have been interested in Taoist and Buddhist ideas since my late teenage years. And I do think rather consciously that the basic Taoist, Buddhist, even in some ways Hindu, take on life and the universe and humanity, the idea that the universe is very big and we're part of it, and the idea that human beings are part of nature, and the idea that things unfold, and some of the classical Chinese ideals, including things like non-aggressive, non-coercive action. I do think they actually did have some impact on how I lived my life. And you kind of rather concisely summarized some of my thoughts about these things. And so that little bit about myself and much more about a number of other people, and Sangasena himself coming back to what he's done in Ladakh, I think with all of us, and also your discussions of tea and things like that, you show multiple examples of how basically what I would call a Taoist worldview can contribute to making our lives today happier and smoother, and achieving things without accomplishment being the specific goal so much, more of letting life in general unfold and our lives unfold, and let it unfold in a gracious and compassionate way that reflects some degree of wisdom and understanding about how things really work in the world. And then I think once you got the book contract, I don't think I had much of a role anymore, except a little bit of technical advice on how to phrase that sentence or how to respond to this question. And I think my impression is your editors at Penguin did a fabulous job. And you got some more help with your artist friend who did the cover. And Penguin had a good idea of writing a kind of an epilogue, which ends the book slightly differently from how it would have ended otherwise. But you still have the original ending, but then with an epilogue after it. And so it's like a double ending, I think works well. So basically, I'm just really happy, and I'm happy to have had a role in helping you get it organized and put together and sold. And I hope it goes into a second printing and that it'll be available to people for many years in the future, I hope.
Regarding the story of Sangasena pointing his finger at the moon and saying that the idea is to catch the moon and forget the fingers, I later found out that it actually, I believe, has its source in the Zhuangzi.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So the Zhuangzi has the saying that the fish trap is how you catch the fish. Having caught the fish, forget the trap. The snare is how you catch the rabbit. Having caught the rabbit, forget the snare. Words are how you capture meaning. Having caught the meaning, forget the words. Where am I going to find someone who has forgotten the words so that I can have a word with him?
Oh, it's beautiful. That's really beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah.